Some say crime has become the dark horse issue of the November midterms, according to CNN Politics, that is. While polling reveals that the economy still ranks as the top issue on voters' minds, crime is next. 71% of registered voters say it's either extremely or very important. Pew Research data shows amongst registered Democrats, 82% of black voters and 33% of white voters see violent crime as a very important voting issue this year. Joining us now to weigh in is movement lawyer Olayemi Olurin and Nick Ohnell Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, Rafael Mangual. Welcome to you both.
Well, hey, morning.
So I'll start with you, Ole. What do you make of the gap between white voters and black voters, with black voters saying that they prefer, that they value or prioritize crime more as an issue, yet them identifying more and voting more for Democrats who broadly in the cultural discourse are being characterized as soft on crime, as it were?
You know, it's this whole myth that only half of the spectrum cares about crime. Everybody cares about crime in the sense that everyone is concerned about safety. That's not the disagreement. No one has ever disputed that black people care about crime too and white people care about crime. It's about how we respond to it. It's this idea that caring about crime is synonymous with supporting tough on crime policies. And that is just not true. I think also we have to talk about what's effective and ineffective. America's always cared about crime. Crime has always been a top issue and a top thing that's discussed in our media and in our elections, has always been it. I also think it's worth mentioning that this poll is discussing that Americans feel like crime is raised rather than any actual facts about whether or not crime is actually up, because there's a lot to do with the fear-mongering in the media and why people feel unsafe whether or not they are safe. But here, I think what this actually just boils down to is we have different ideas on how we respond to crime and how we address public safety. It's not really so much about crime so much as it's about safety. And right now, we've continued to put tons and tons of money. America puts more money into prison and policing and addressing crime. That way, an proven ineffective method for addressing crime for decades and decades and decades, and it hasn't done anything. So to me, it's not really so much about whether or not we care about crime or who cares about it more, what the gap is. I think we all care about crime and public safety. I think it's just about certain groups and different advocates recognizing that policing and mass incarceration doesn't do anything to address public safety.
Rafael, I want to get your perspective on this. Crime getting much worse in at least some places. Philadelphia, for instance, is really suffering right now. What are the policy, if Republicans want to run on this issue successfully and say that Democratic policies have left some of our cities vulnerable, et cetera, what are Republicans saying that they're going to do differently, or what should they be saying?
Well, I think what their focus needs to be is highlighting the fact that the Democrats have sort of made it part of their central brand that they are for decarceration and depolicing. They are for diverting more people away from prisons and jails. They are for releasing more people from prisons and jails. You have the Cut 50 initiative, which Biden, committed to supporting while on the campaign trail. I think Republicans need to do the work of showing what the connection is between that kind of policy agenda and the sorts of crimes that people are worried about. And the reality is that the vast majority of people in prison today are people who have somewhere between 10 and 12 prior arrests and 5 and 6 prior convictions. These are not people who've been denied second chances. These are people who pose a significant threat to the public. We know that because the recidivism data tells us that 83% of people released from state prison in the U.S. are going to go on to reoffend at least once, which means that prison is already largely reserved for repeat chronic offenders who have a very high likelihood of going on to commit more crimes. If we push a policy agenda that is going to put more of those individuals on the street, we're going to see more victimizations as a result. And that's, I think, the message that Republicans would be most effective at pushing right now.
Well, Amy, I want to give you a chance to respond to that.
It's so funny how we use the mass incarceration and mass incarceration's failures as a grounds and an argument for why we should continue to mass incarcerate. The reality is we currently have mass incarceration. And despite the statistics that you're pointing out, first and foremost, over 80% of the criminal cases that are in our legal system are misdemeanors, traffic offenses, or nonviolent crime. It has nothing to do with violent crime. That's first and foremost. But second of all, saying that we have a criminal system that preys on particular populations, because that's the truth. The vast majority of the people in our criminal system are poor, are living beneath the poverty line, are represented by public defenders. So taking the fact that poor people are already disproportionately incarcerated and profiled by a criminal system and then put into prison and come with all the collateral consequences that come with that, the rap sheet, the inability to get a job, the inability to get housing, and everything that comes from that, and then say, hey, those populations that we have criminalized and we put into prison, they continue their recidivists. They continue to do the same thing, and we continue to put them back there. So it sounds like the approach to addressing crime has been ineffective. That's what we're saying. And as much as I would love, I would love for it to be what you're saying about the Democrats be true, that they have embraced a profile, a platform of decarcerating and moving us away from mass incarceration. That would be beautiful if they have, but they haven't. If you look at places like New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, all these places that they keep trying to paint as Gotham City or the most dangerous places ever, despite the fact that not only do Republican and rural areas have more crime per capita, but New York City and places like this spend more money on policing and mass incarceration than anybody else. So we have to pick a struggle. It can't just be, oh, mass incarceration and policing and incarceration, that's what's linked to public safety, which, by the way, tons of statistics and studies have already showed that that's not the case. But more importantly, we're already doing it. So if the problem is that, mass incarceration and policing and prisons is what we should be doing to address crime, well, we're already doing it. And according to y'all, it's not safe, it's not working. So how could that be the successful platform that people should be running on?
Well, Rafael, let me ask you this. For example, about half, 53% of LA's budget, the entire city budget, is devoted to funding policing. Do you think that a larger percentage of the city budget should be going to policing? Is the answer to continue to throw money at the issue, as Olay points, has been the plan for the last however many decades that this country has existed and the police force has existed? At what point do you think a strategy change needs to be implemented if there is, in fact, no correlation between driving up police funding to, again, 50% of the city budget, more than all of the other social support services that could keep people out of poverty and all the other drivers of crime? At what point is it better to reinvest those funds elsewhere if it's clear that just more and more money isn't correlating with lower incidents of crime?
Well, I think the first thing to address is that it's actually not clear that more money directed toward policing isn't correlated with crime. Every single study that's ever been done of investments in policing shows positive returns on those investments.
I'm sorry, Rafael, but that's very, very plainly not true.
Not true.
I couldn't
Can you
disagree
cite
more.
a specific study? I'm happy to pull it up.
Yeah, sure. Aaron Chalfin looked at police spending in 2010 and found $1.63 return for every dollar spent on policing in 2010. You have the paper out of the University of Pennsylvania.
I'm sorry, I guess I don't understand what that means. Can you help me understand what it means to have $1.63 return on a dollar worth of spending on the police?
Sure. For every dollar spent on policing, they were able to calculate the reduced victimization costs, which mainly came from a reduction in homicides. Aaron Chalfin, along with Morgan Williams and a couple of other economists, were also the lead authors of a study showing that for every single police officer hired, you abate 0.1 homicides, and that those effects are felt twice as much in the Black community as in the white community. So that's just one of, or two of very many studies showing that when you invest more in policing, when you increase police presence, you reduce crime in that area. It's one of the most common findings in the criminological literature.
Help me understand this then. You're arguing that Democrats have defunded the police. In fact, Democrats have raised police budgets across the country. At the same time, conservatives are saying that crime rates are up. Now, mostly there's a lot of reporting on crime rates that have given people a sense that crime rates are up. But regardless, if crime rates are up is the argument, and also Democrats have in fact been fighting the police harder. I wish that weren't the case. I don't believe in that as a policy, but they have in fact been doing it. I don't understand. They're already doing what you want them to do, so it's hard for me to grasp what the argument is here. How can you claim that there is a correlation between lower crime rates and lower police funding when we're seeing higher crime rates and higher police funding?
Well, it would be even higher than if we were not doing the investment in policing
exactly.
that we're doing now,
the
right?
question is whether or not
suggests.
we are worse off than we otherwise would have been
So
had we been taking the right steps. And that's the answer to the question, right there.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
America makes up, 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's incarcerated population. America spends about $277 billion on policing every year and another $80 billion on prison. If we're looking at a place like New York City, which is the place that people like to use as a target for Gotham City, we have 35,000 officers in the NYPD. We give over $10.4 billion in spending. We give $860 million in Rikers, and we've increased that number every year. We have continued to increase, even from 2020 to now. We've increased police funding. We've increased the amount of money we put in mass incarceration. And according to what y'all are saying, it is not safer. So tell me how the strategy, and by the way, Democrats, Democratic mayor, Democratic governor, Democrat in every office, Democrat in the DA's office, and they are Democrats that are in fact putting more money into policing and mass incarceration. So which is it? Again, which is it? Is it the fact, is it dangerous because we're not putting enough money into policing and mass incarceration? Or are Democrats failing because they are not arguing this enough, or they have a decarcerating platform? Acknowledge that they don't have that.
I mean, I think it's really easy to just continue to say the opposite of what's true. But the reality is that the NYPD is down more than 7% of its officers since 2020. The reality is that the New York State has instituted bail reform. It's instituted discovery reform. It's instituted raise the age legislation. It's instituted less is more.
Right?
I understand that.
Police officers chose to leave. That wasn't a defunding the police issue. We're talking about police funding, not police deciding.
I didn't say that it was, but we did cut two entire academy classes as a result of the defunding, and that creates a lag.
There wasn't defunding, Rafael. We have to be clear about what was and wasn't done.
But there was. Okay, let's look at Rafael. I want to get your perspective on what's going on. Again, I point to Philadelphia, where the violent crime rate is, everyone admits, is up very precipitously. The youth gun deaths way up. And I'm looking at this report produced by Philadelphia lawmakers, Philadelphia House, criticizing Larry Krasner, the progressive prosecutor, who has not been, according to this report, prosecuting illegal gun possessions, and so there are more people with legal guns on the streets, and thus more crime. That's the implication here, which does, in my view, what's your perspective on that, Rafael? Does impugn progressive policies?
Yeah, I think that's just one example of lowering the transaction costs of crime and making it more likely that you're going to see exactly that kind of behavior. I mean, the idea that Larry Krasner diverting a significantly higher rate of gun offenders than his predecessor has not impacted public safety is, I think, one of the silliest ideas that you could perpetrate. And it's not one that's actually been looked at by any of the studies that people will point to claim that progressive prosecution doesn't have an effect on crime, right? These studies showing, for example, that, you can pick out progressive prosecutor cities that had lower crime increases than non-progressive prosecutor cities. Well, that doesn't really tell you a lot, especially given the fact that Baltimore is one of them, but the reason for that is that it peaked in 2019. It set an all-time homicide rate record. And so the fact that crime went down in 2020 in Baltimore, despite having Marilyn Mosby as the progressive prosecutor, doesn't tell you anything about what progressive prosecutors do or don't do. Again, I mean, what you have here is a kind of rhetorical ploy where you pretend that the argument is something that it's not. The argument here is not that progressive prosecutors are responsible for the entirety of the uptick. The argument here is that these policies leave us worse off than we otherwise would be. And that's not been tested by any of the studies that have been pointed to.
Well, Rafael, I do want to ask you about this because there was a study that came out. There was a more recent study than this, but there's something called the red state murder problem, where homicide rates are especially high in conservative states, and that's been linked to gun policies there. And very rarely, and I think this is right that this doesn't happen a lot. Very rarely do you hear Democrats saying, hey, it's Republican, tough on crime policy. There isn't pointing to gun policies for sure, but the idea that different groups of people, because of who runs a state, are kind of insensitive to crime as a consequence of crimes happening in their state, I think is a kind of craven and not especially productive way to go about talking about these issues. So I have no interest in blaming people in red states for horrible tragedies that are happening there, but it does seem to be a really selective bias that says, well, crime is up all over the country. It's not, but the crime is up all over the country. This city, which is a large metropolis, which tend to be Democrat because people of color live there and are fans of the historical social programs that allowed people of color to have access to the franchise, et cetera. And therefore, there's more crime there, when of course similar things are happening in red states where there are high crime rates, et cetera. What is the solution, in your view, to actually bringing down crime? If, again, crime is very much correlated to poverty. When you see downswings in crime, it's often because people who are committing the crimes are no longer in those precarious situations. You point to the idea that there's a marginal benefit to spending more dollars on police, but studies have been very clear that there's a much greater benefit in investing in communities and making sure that people aren't poor to begin with. So what's the cost-benefit analysis? Do you think it's right for a city to be spending 50% of its funding on police officers?
Yeah, well, I think one thing to be clear about is, if I'm not mistaken, that figure of 53% doesn't account for the fact that LA gets a lot of its, LA City gets a lot of its funding for other social services from the county and the state. And so, that may not exactly be representative of what other cities are doing. But I also want to push back on the idea that there's a correlation. But I want to push back on the idea that there's a correlation here between poverty and the sort of violence that we've seen actually go up. That's just not true. I mean, take New York City, for example, 1989, which is the year before New York City peaked with 2,262 homicides. Our citywide poverty rate was actually slightly lower than it was in 2016, which is the year before we hit our valley of 292 homicides. So we decreased homicides by about 90%, where poverty didn't move almost at all. In fact, it moved slightly in the wrong direction. We didn't see crime go up during the Great Recession, where we had the unemployment rate across the nation nearly double. During that time, the homicide rate declined by 15%. We didn't see a homicide spike during the Great Depression in the United States. We did see one during the 1920s, which is one of the periods of economic boom in this country. So the idea that there's a clear correlation between poverty and violence, I think
there isn't a clear. That's
wrong.
A straw man, Rafael. And your argument basically is that while people were quarantined, crime was down, so poverty didn't have an effect.
Last word on this.
Go ahead,
Olayemi. I don't have the last word. I honestly, I really don't. I really just wanted to clarify that we're really making the argument that like we came up with it essentially. The correlation between poverty and crime is hilarious. We have a criminal system that the vast majority of everybody in the system is broke, destitute. Over 60% of the people that are in our criminal system, over 2 million people are incarcerated in this country, 400,000 of which are held pre-trial, and over 60% of them made less than $12,000 annually prior to arrest. Poverty is what's in our system. I'm not asking you, unfortunately, I'm telling you, the majority of the people that are being represented in our system are represented by public defenders, which means they are underneath the poverty line. What you're saying is just not the case. If you look at it,
he's saying that the crime rate doesn't track the poverty rate, not that criminals are not poor.
Right. This doesn't tell you anything about. This doesn't tell you anything about which direction the causation.
Well, your feels
right?
and vibes it doesn't matter if that's not what the data shows.
The data shows it very clearly, though, Rabbi. That's what's so concerning.
But it doesn't.
But it clearly
really doesn't because
it
doesn't tell
does.
you. It doesn't tell you what direction the causation runs in. Right. The fact that the vast majority of people who come into contact with the criminal justice system are poor does not tell you that poverty causes violence, because most poor people are not criminals and they're not violent criminals. Right. The reality is that the sorts of dispositions that are likely to result in poor performance in our economic system are also likely to be correlated with criminal activity. That's the reality. The fact of the matter is that more common in the prison population in the United States is antisocial personality disorder, which has a prevalence rate among men in the general population of between 2 and 4%, but a prevalence rate in prison settings of between 40 and 70%.
Rafael, I really want to let Olay get a chance to get a word in there.
Go ahead, Olay.
You're right that we do have a criminal system that's filled with mentally ill people and people that are not getting mental health services, right? People with mental health issues are 3 to 4 times more likely to end up incarcerated in America. That is an aggravating factor, to your point, not a mitigating factor. Additionally, as much as you want to focus on violent crime, and say all these different things and suggest that poverty has nothing to do with violence, which is absurd. But like I said at the beginning of this conversation, over 80% of the things in our criminal system have nothing to do with violent crime. They're misdemeanors, traffic offenses, or non-violent crime. So you can't just want to take out poverty and analysis to focus on sensationalizing violent crime when the majority of the people sitting in our criminal system are there for non-violent crime. So anyway, but I respect your disagreement on the topic.
Well, thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we got to leave it there. Really appreciate you both, Olayemi, Olurin, and Rafael Mangual. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
More Rising right after this.